It's my privilege to be able to introduce the faculty lectureship participant today, Clara Kundin, assistant professor in theater. She comes to us from St. Paul's College and Arizona State University. I went to U of A. That was a long time ago. She's a much more recent graduate. As always, I want to thank the folks who actually do the work and actually make this happen. The committee members for the faculty lectureship, Dr. Matt Haney, Dr. Brian Pascoe, Dr. Pamela Schuler, Dr. Chelsea Starr, Dr. Kathleen Wagner. This would not happen without the support of Dr. Lorenz, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and the assistance of Melissa Brose in getting the food together in the presentation area, Maddie Verf with Sodexo for the actual food itself, and from Communication Services, John Hauser and Adam Aragon, who will be filming this and then putting it up later on YouTube. So without further ado, we'll start the lectureship. Remember, this is very informal, but very informative. And if you need any refreshments ongoing or after, please help yourself. So thank you very much.
Cool, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. John can tell you, I perform for a living, and I'm more nervous about this than just about any performance I've done. So I'm very grateful to you for being here, and thank you to Dr. Montgomery and the committee, and for John Barr for pushing me to apply to this. So today I'm going to talk about accessible practices to support neurodivergent actors, and we will talk about what that big word means. If you would like to follow along on your phones on my Google slide, you can scan the QR code, and that will take you to the slides if that's easier to read for you. So I'll give you a second for that. And I tested the QR code, so I think it should be working. Okay. Every once in a while, it's like, surprise, it was just a 7-day trial. And then, yeah. Cool. Good. All right. Okay, so today I'm going to give a little overview about what neurodivergency is, what my research is. I'll talk about, and some key terms. Oops, I'm clicking on the wrong one because I have my notes here. Talk about some key terms and give an overview. And then I'll talk about historical practices that folks have used in theater to support neurodivergent performers. And then I'll talk about what we should be doing now today and what I'm doing and some of my research. And then I'll talk about how does this apply to you, because I, with the exception of Dr. Beck and Iris, I'm the only person making theater in this room, and John, so I want to make sure this feels relevant to y'all working in other classrooms or in other settings. So we'll have some time to talk about that. I have two primary goals for this presentation. One is that I want you all to expand what you think of when you think of the word disability. I think there's a lot of things that we jump to about, disabled person, okay, they use a wheelchair, or neurodivergent, they're autistic. And so I want to expand our awareness of other disabilities out there. And then I want to expand our understanding of when and where accommodations for disabilities should be used. We all get, as teachers, we get the email saying, hey, these students need accommodations in your classrooms, but there are a lot more settings where we can be accommodating students or other people we encounter. So those are my two main goals. The photo is showing a scene from Romeo and Juliet that I directed in the fall here at ENMU, where I implemented some accessibility measures that I'll talk about. All right, so let's get started. What does neurodiversity mean? All right, who wants to give it a go? What is neurodiversity? This is an interactive presentation. Differences in ways of thinking and processing. Differences in how your brain works. Yeah. Yeah. What are examples of neurodiversities or disabilities? Amazing. Yeah?
Well, Jerry Seinfeld says he thinks he's on the spectrum and that informs some of his observational comedy.
Absolutely. So autism spectrum disorder is a neurodivergence. Yes, definitely. Cool. All right, so here's the fancy definition. Neurodiversity acts as an umbrella term, and it captures a lot of different things. So including autism spectrum disorder, ASD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Mears-Erlin syndrome, Tourette syndrome, synesthesia, and other similar atypical conditions. The term arose in the late 1990s out of the work of Judy Singer, an autism and disability activist and Australian sociologist, as a way to shift perceptions from a deficit perspective to one of different strengths and abilities and disrupt ableist thinking and structures. So the term is you would hear neurodiverse and neurotypical, and you notice that there's no value judgment in those terms. It's not, oh, your brain is working in a good way or a bad way. It's just neurotypical, the typical way, or it's divergent. It's a divergent way. And so that's coming from a goal of trying to undo an ableist notion that disabled people are somehow worse, right, than abled people. So what I'd like you to notice is this term neurodiversity, it's an umbrella term, so it's really broad. And there are a ton of conditions listed here, many of which you probably haven't heard of, myself included. I need to do some work on, I don't know, Mears-Erlin syndrome. And there's some that aren't even listed here. So it's a really broad term that captures a lot. And so that's what I first want to get to the first point of broadening our awareness of disability, is that the word disability and disabled, it's huge, and it captures a lot that we're not even thinking about in our regular lives until we encounter someone who has that specific disability. So why does it matter that we have an awareness of a lot of disabilities? So I'll tell a story from a class that I was teaching at Arizona State University. I was teaching an acting movement class. It's a real hippy-dippy theater class. So I was asking my students we were doing an exercise where we embody the elements. So we were moving around the room, and I was coaching them to be fire, earth, air, and water. And we spent, about 30 minutes doing woo-woo physical stuff. And at the end of the activity, we all circle up, and I always ask my students and my actors when I do workshops like these, which element was easier for you to embody and which was more difficult? Because generally, all of us have an element that we resonate with. And usually a student will say, oh, I like this one better, or this one better. Well, one of my students said, well, all of it was hard for me because I have aphantasia. And I said, what's that? I said that, I was already in the process of doing this kind of research on neurodiversity, so this was a new one for me, even with the background in this field. So my student very generously told me what was going on. Aphantasia is a condition that means you are unable to make mental pictures. So if I said, picture an apple, most of you would have a picture of an apple in your brain, but about 2% of the population can't do that visualization. It's a condition that's not well studied or well known because it affects so few people, and it doesn't come up a lot. A lot of people don't realize, oh, this is not typical, until you have the acting teacher who tells you, imagine you're a river, and they can't do it. There is some correlation between aphantasia and the autistic community. So if you work with autistic students and do visualization exercises, that might come up. But it's not a disability that you're going to get an accommodation request for, right? V is not going to email you saying, hey, by the way, for this student, you need to not ask them to use mental imagery. That just doesn't happen. So this is an example I share to show why it's important to start becoming aware of it's impossible all, but more disabilities than you think you need to, perhaps, because you'll encounter students who have differences that you need to accommodate as a teacher. I wasn't going to just tell the student, oh no, too bad you can't do the exercise, right? So what did I do? I just changed my language very simply in the moment. And since then, I might do some other things, but in the moment, I was able to make just a really quick shift, and that's something I think it's important to think about. Access can feel intimidating or hard, but often it's very easy to change something small. So before, I was prompting the students by saying, imagine you are a river. How do you move around the space? What is your tempo, your direction? So I was telling them to imagine, and then I was asking them questions that they had to fill in the blanks for. So after my students shared this, and now when I teach this kind of exercise in my classrooms, I change my language to be more prescriptive. I say, you are a river, and here's how you move around the space. You move quickly and in a forward-moving direction. And nothing is sacrificed from the exercise, because the important thing is the student embodying it, not them coming up with the image of what they're embodying. I also could include video, things like that, give examples. I tell them to copy other students. But this was just the quick shift I made in the moment. So an example of just a simple change can make a student more successful in the classroom. One thing I'll come back to a few times. So that's an example from the classroom, but the classroom is not the only place of learning, nor is it the final destination. So we're all teaching our students so that hopefully they will leave and go do the things we're teaching them. And a lot of us are teaching in non-traditional settings, right? I get a course release every semester to direct a play, and that is part of my teaching load, but it is not a classroom. And the accommodation requests I get for it don't make sense, right? I'm not getting a request that says extra time on testing in rehearsal when there's no tests. So I want us to be thinking about what are the places where we might need to be more accommodating in our practices that are spaces of learning, or are the places our students are going to go after they graduate that we're training them for, but aren't maybe a classroom where we're used to. So I'll talk a little bit about my background and where all this research came from. This is a photo of me at the Mary McDowell Friends School with a bunch of kids in crazy costumes, taken in probably like 2016 or 2017. So when I first moved to New York, I was hired as a teaching artist and placed at a school for children with learning disabilities. And I was told, make a play. We've tried to do plays with scripts, it doesn't work, go. And so I floundered and I did some Googling, and I found very little to support me making plays with these students who struggled to read, who struggled to memorize, who struggled with language in general. And here's, I'll give a definition of what a specific learning disability is, because that's where I really focus my research. So neurodiversity, again, very broad. And I talked about it more generally. Now I'm going to zoom in for the rest of this presentation to specific learning disabilities where I really focus my research. So specific learning disabilities are genetic and or neurobiological factors that alter brain functioning in a manner which affects one or more cognitive processes related to learning. These processing problems can interfere with learning basic skills such as reading, writing, and or math. They can also interfere with higher level skills such as organization, time planning, abstract reasoning, long or short-term memory, and attention. So examples of specific learning disabilities, SLDs, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, it's a writing disability, auditory processing disabilities, memory disabilities. ADHD and autism actually aren't specific learning disabilities, but they're related, and often folks have both. But all of these are under that umbrella of neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So I started focusing my research on specific learning disabilities, particularly how can we accommodate them in performance processes versus a classroom setting, because I was trying to make a play with these kids. I wasn't teaching them in a classroom. I was trying to just put on a play, and I couldn't find a lot of support. So I went to grad school, and here we are. Ta-da! All right, so I'll drink water first. So I started my research by looking at what we've done in the past, asking the question, what techniques, strategies, accommodations, and modifications have directors and arts educators used when directing actors of all ages with learning disabilities? I do a lot of work with young people, but these accommodations are useful for folks of all ages. So I was literally trying to look and see what have we been doing, what research is already out there. Now that I'm in school and have access to the scholarly databases I didn't as a teaching artist. And I didn't find a ton. So here's what we found. So the first mention of a performance accommodation for someone with a specific learning disability was in 1984. The Texas Education Agency published a guide, and it's a holistic guide helping educators do performances with students but of a variety of disabilities, but they specifically mention learning disabilities. This is the first mention that I found of a specific learning disability accommodation. And then there's radio silence for about 10 years, which is interesting because the Individuals with Disability Act, Education Act passed in 1990. So I'm kind of intrigued that there was just like nothing for a while. But eventually in the UK, we start seeing some newspaper articles that are talking about theater companies there that are making work with disabled artists, inclusive of artists with learning disabilities. However, the UK, their definition of learning disability is a lot broader than the US definition. So it's inclusive of folks with Down syndrome, and other cognitive disabilities in a way that our US definition isn't. But primarily in the UK, folks were using devising as an accommodation method, and devising is just a way of making a play without a script. So you, as a collective, create the play. Then starting in 2013 is when we really in earnest start seeing some scholarly publications around learning disability in theater. Deborah Leveroy writes a lot about actor training for dyslexic actors. Darren Oram writes about dyspraxia with actor training. And then Petronilla Whitfield writes primarily about dyslexia, but a little bit about neurodiversity more broadly in Shakespearean actor training. So we start seeing more scholarship, but it's still really concentrated on actor training and less on actor performance. So an acting class versus an actor performance. Then in 2018, the US starts catching up with some disabled theater companies that are inclusive of artists with learning disabilities. They are also using devising, group making of a play as their primary method. And then I'm happy to say that I published a few things and have another publication coming in 2025 soon, like imminent, that I talk a little bit more about specifically accommodations for learning disabled actors in performance settings. So after I looked at like the existing literature, I turned to a survey of the field because there just wasn't much existing literature. And I knew that people were working with disabled actors. 20% of the population has a learning disability, so it is like the odds are good that there are learning disabled actors. And I know this is like impossible to read. So what I've got here are two charts, and forgive me, I'm not like a statistician, but they're comparing responses from directors about accommodation practices that they use for actors who disclose a learning disability and actors who don't disclose a learning disability. So they might be disabled, they might not, they haven't disclosed, but they still ask for an accommodation. And on the side, these are the accommodation requests. So assistance learning lines in the green, easy read scripts in the blue, recorded texts in the yellow, teleprompter use in the blue, devising in orange, extended rehearsal time in purple, and then other in pink. And what I want you to notice is basically the graphs are about the same. So whether or not directors know that they're working with disabled artists or are intentional about supporting disabled artists specifically, directors are helping actors in the same way, primarily by giving them assistance learning lines, which can look like a variety of different things, or using extended rehearsal time. So directors are doing more or less the same thing no matter what the population, because often people don't, and there's probably a variety of reasons, but often people don't disclose that they have a disability. They just might say, hey, can I have an extra week to learn these lines, right? And you say yes. And also learning lines, even if you don't have a disability, is challenging, right? It's the number one question you get at a talk back after a show is, how do you learn all those lines? So basically, directors are already doing accommodations for people, both disabled and not. I also interviewed some directors specifically about their work and got a few more examples of accommodation practices they use. The first is advanced access to audition sides. So in professional theater, it is common practice. You might get your audition material in advance, maybe a day or two, and then you go in and you do it, and then you might be handed a scene and you're asked to do what's called a cold read, where you have to just take a minute, read it over, and then go. And obviously that's really challenging for someone with any kind of reading comprehension disability, dyslexia, etc. So giving people their audition material in advance is a good practice. Other directors are holding audition workshops where they teach people how to audition and that's supportive of people with a variety of disabilities. I'm thinking in particular for autistic folks, to know what they're going to experience beforehand would be really useful. One director shared that they use Slack as a resource to find information and as a social outlet, which I thought was interesting. So making use of a virtual platform to help facilitate community and keep things organized was something they thought of as an accommodation measure. Other measures include cutting the script, making it shorter, which absolutely, if you have trouble memorizing, having less to memorize is going to help you. Common practice is to have multiple directors on a team, so you can work with folks with high access needs, split, divide and conquer kind of thing. Or the use of mentors in the rehearsal process is very common, where I might assign a disabled actor a buddy to work with. I'd say that's less common for someone with a learning disability versus someone with autism or Downs or a disability that affects cognitive processing. And then one director shared that they're just patient, and they thought of that as an access measure, which I thought was kind of lovely. I hope that we're all just patient all the time, but it's maybe useful to think of that as like, oh yeah, I need to just be accommodating students. I don't know what's the reason for needing an accommodation, but if I'm just patient. So I thought that was a good thing to keep in mind. So that was kind of the first stage of my research. Looking at what has been done and what people are currently doing. And I found that most commonly directors use devising, making the plays, extended rehearsal time, and adaptive strategies with the text to support their learning disabled actors. And across the board, directors mostly seem to share like, yeah, I feel pretty comfortable doing this, and I need more support, which I thought was interesting. So I didn't get a lot of responses saying, I'm totally underwater, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like, I think as educators, as directors, we're pretty used to accommodating people, but overall, directors were saying, and I need some more help. And then I found through all of this is that the scholarly research in particular centers on this actor training with very little consideration for what comes next. And very little consideration for what happens in a performance after the actor is sufficiently trained. And this is a photo from Mary Poppins Jr. at Spotlight Youth Theater, which I directed using some of these practices. I have two cute little bees. They're delightful. So again, my reminder for why I think this is important is that the classroom is not the only place of learning, nor is it the final destination. So, with that in mind, I embarked on some practical research and a couple of case studies, which I'll talk about in a minute. Another thing I want to note is that what I'm describing here and what I'm suggesting that we do goes above and beyond what is legally required of us. So the school has to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Every employer has to comply with this, right? And that is the minimum of what we should be doing to help disabled folks in our classrooms and our artistic practices. And that is because access is not a checklist, and that's something like the disability community will say quite often. It's not a checklist, and so you can't just say, okay, I'm done, I'm accessible, right? Instead, access is a process that's continuing evolving and negotiating, and you have to work it out with your students and your actors. So a lot of what I'm suggesting is above and beyond, and that's intentional. All right, so I'll talk a bit about the case study research I did. So based on the scholarly research I found, the interviews, etc., and my own experience, I developed a checklist, even though I said checklists are bad. I developed a checklist for me to use personally to try out and test some accessibility measures in a variety of settings. So I directed, or assistant directed, several shows. This is a photo from the first, a play called Anthropocene, which was a devised, collectively created play at Arizona State University about climate change. I worked as assistant director for The Diary of Anne Frank at Child's Play Theater in partnership with the Bridge Initiative, which was with professional actors for youth audiences, but professional actors. Then I directed Mary Poppins Jr., which you saw the photo of with young people. And then finally I directed Peter and the Starcatcher at Mesa Encore Theater, which is a community theater, so working with a variety of community members, all adults. And I thought it was important to test these access measures in a variety of settings because different people need different things, right? Shockingly, the professional actors didn't have much problem memorizing because they've been doing that for years and years and are trained to do that. And they were trained in a process that was not accommodating of access needs, right? So they knew how to succeed in a non-accessible world. Versus my youth actors, a lot of trouble memorizing because they're children, but also my community theater actors had a lot of trouble with the text because they are not professionals, they're coming from a variety of backgrounds, and many of them had learning disabilities. So a real mix of folks in there. So during these rehearsals and performances, I implemented a bunch of practices, which I'll talk about in a moment. I made my observations, sorry, microphone, and then I surveyed the actors afterwards to see what was effective, and I also interviewed the directors as well to get information. And based on those conversations and interviews, etc., I have a variety of suggestions for if you happen to be going out and making a play that I'll talk about. And think some of these are specific to theater, but you also might start thinking about, okay, how does this connect to my field, my area, my classroom, whatever I'm doing, my office, etc. So some changes I'd suggest to make right away are to switch to using sans serif font and size 14 to 16 point fonts in digital materials if you're able. That's made very easy. Canvas pretty much already does that for us, and I know we're working on getting it to have a bigger font size. But you'll notice my presentation is on the sans serif font, and that helps folks with dyslexia. It's just easier to read. I suggest providing space for actors or folks in your classrooms to share their access needs. So everybody, disabled or not, has access needs. One of your access needs generally is that you need to eat food, right? In order to be able to be comfortable here, you need to be either fed or eating. And so Michelle over there is taking care of her access need right now by eating during this presentation, because I'm sure she knew I would not get, or I'm drinking water during the presentation. So we all have access needs. And so it's not, but giving people a chance to share their access needs gives disabled folks in particular a space to share theirs. And so in advance of a rehearsal, I'll send a survey, which I'll talk about in a moment, and I say, hey, tell me your access needs, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But giving folks a space to share those needs in advance of a process, I think, is important. And then in rehearsals themselves, I start every day with an access check-in, and I use the model from Nicole Brewer's anti-racist training for theater, where you start a rehearsal and just very briefly go around the room and you share your access needs. So you either say, I need to use a drink of water, hey, my knee is bothering me today, I need to sit out, whatever your access need is, or you'll say, my access needs are met. And she's specific about that phrasing because it's not that you don't have access needs, it's just that they're being met right now. I have my water bottle, so I don't need anything else, it's full. Versus, I need to go fill my water bottle before I do this presentation, that's my access need. So I give my actors space to share that before rehearsal. And we get really comfy with it, so by the end of the rehearsal process, it's just bing, bang, boom, 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 yeah, I'm good. And it takes about 30 seconds. Other things to do, providing digital and hard copies of all audition and callback and rehearsal materials. So folks can use either a hard copy or a digital copy, whichever they prefer, and get that in advance. I provide detailed character descriptions and contextual information for scenes. And why I do this is often in an audition setting, you'll get a side, that's a scene, that you need to read. and you have no idea who the character is. Maybe it's a new play you've never heard of, you haven't read, and you have to just make a choice. It's very challenging if you don't know who the character is, particularly for someone with a reading comprehension disability or something that's going to make it more difficult for them to intuit what the scene is about. So if you can provide descriptions in advance about the scenes, the plays, the characters, etc., that'll help your actors with specific disabilities and everybody else. This is a controversial one. I suggest allowing candidates to audition without being memorized. If you are someone with a memory disability, it's going to be difficult or impossible to memorize. So I could get on a soapbox about why I think memorization maybe isn't that important in theater. A lot of folks probably don't agree with that. But allowing candidates to audition without being memorized, for example, in the community theater setting, was really productive. I had a ton of people come in with monologues that they read that I think wouldn't have come in at all if I had required them to be memorized. Caveat here is Leonard Madrid and I in our department have noticed that some of our actors in our smaller setting take advantage of this when we know they have a monologue memorized. So when you know your community, you can tailor your recommendations, right? So now Leonard and I are like, you know what, why don't we make this an option for non-majors and first years, but we expect our upperclassmen to be memorized, unless there's a specific case, but generally we know they have a monologue ready to go. So this is again an example of why like a checklist isn't all that useful because you have to tailor things based on your situation. So that's one that I'm in the process of tailoring. I suggest eliminating cold read requirements. I already talked about that. Then I always ask for consent from the actors to participate in the day one read-through of the script. This is standard in theater processes where you read through the script on the first day, and it's often a very high-stress situation in professional settings where you've got the producers and the other actors, and you all feel like you have to be amazing to justify why you're there. And so for someone with dyslexia, it's already hard, and then you add in all that stress. So I generally ask, hey, is it okay if we do this in an email beforehand? And that gives actors a chance to opt out, in which case then I'd have a stage manager read their lines, right? It's a pretty simple switcheroo, or I'd read their lines. I always block scenes prior to encouraging memorization. So blocking is the physical movements that you do. It's pretty standard in professional settings in particular to be asked to come in memorized right away. I've had day one, you should be memorized. I have a lot of trouble with that, even as someone who doesn't have a learning disability, because I learn better when I can move around and do things and move in groove. So I suggest that in all processes, even professional ones, that you give actors time to at least move through the scenes before asking them to memorize. I also suggest rehearsing scenes in show order. So if your disability affects your ability to sequence events, it can be very challenging to start rehearsing the last scene and then jump to the first scene, right? And this in particular, I think, is a challenge in film settings where you're often rehearsing out of order. So as much as possible, I try and rehearse in order. I fudge that sometimes. If we're doing a musical, I want to rehearse all the big dance numbers sooner rather than later, even if they're out of order. But then to help, if I'm going out of order, I post written scene lists backstage that say, well, here's the order of the play. So this is an example of the questions from the Access survey that I sent to my actors in Romeo and Juliet, which a photo there from our fall production. So as I already mentioned, I asked, do you consent to the day one cold read through of the script? And then I asked, specific to the show, do you have any physical or mobility concerns that you want us to be aware of? Because it was a very high movement, high combat show, and so this is a chance for them to share their needs. And then I add specific questions based on what the thing we're doing is. And then I ask more general questions. Tell me about your rehearsal preferences. What do you like? How do you best grasp new material? And so somebody can share, and everybody has the opportunity to share, whether they're disabled or not. It's an open space. And then the final thing I do is that I make a list, and I say, here are all the access measures I can provide. Which ones would you like? So I'm thinking about my abilities, my labor. What can I actually provide in this moment? Do I have an assistant director who can help me do some of the things that might take more time? And I list them out, and then actors can check what they want to do. And the reason I do this is that that some of what I'm doing is new, and many of us aren't familiar with the possibilities of what could be, right? We don't think to know that we need something until it's given to us or offered to us. For example, captions. I am not hard of hearing, but boy, do I love captions on a movie. And I didn't really realize, I wouldn't think to ask for that until I just happened to watch something with captions and was like, wow, I'm enjoying this a lot. Let me keep doing this. So I give them options of what to do. And I found, even in my short time being here, that in the first semester, everybody checked everything. They were like, oh boy, we can do all the things. And then and I was like, oh, that's a lot of work. But then in the second semester, people who, I had a lot of repeating actors, they only checked the things that they really needed. So they're starting to get a sense for what they actually need versus, wow, so many things we could do. So access work takes time, and sometimes it takes money. And so I want to acknowledge that. So here are some suggestions of things to do when you have the time or ability or money to do so. This first one is a big one that I am bad about, making sure all your digital materials are compatible with an e-reader. If you're a teacher who scans textbook readings, they're never compatible, and I really wrestle with this. I don't want to assign a textbook my students have to buy for an intro level class, but then I use scans that aren't accessible. So this is something in my hypothetical utopic world, everything would be compatible. But if you're able to slowly work towards that, it's for the best. Often scripts, like we're making photocopies of them and they're not e-reader compatible. But a lot of script companies will give you an accessible copy if you email and ask. Other changes to make captions in all videos. Obviously a lot of platforms like Panopto do that for you, which is amazing. But like, I'll pull videos from YouTube that don't have them and they're old, so starting to shift towards that. Then if you have time, scheduling audition slots with a generous time allowance, giving folks time. So this can help folks with a variety of needs, but for example, if you are dyslexic and I say, hey, I need you to read this scene, and we're rushed, all of a sudden you're in a time pressure situation where you have to read it really quickly, versus if I give you a lot of time, you can say, hey, let me go in the hall, let me work for 10 minutes, etc. So if you have the time, doing that is useful. I schedule dedicated rehearsal time for learning lines. This is not done in professional theater or frankly any theater I've been a part of generally. So I will call actors and say, this is your time to learn lines. This is the time you've blocked off for rehearsal. You weren't called tonight, but here, go do that. Or Iris can attest, if I notice an actor needs some time to work on lines, I'll say, hey, my stage manager, can you go work with this person, right? So I'm really involved with helping my actors learn lines, which is a big departure from the norm. I record rehearsed scenes, songs, and choreography, and I put it in a Google Drive so people can access it. So if that helps folks with memory disabilities, you can just watch it and keep practicing at home. And then I send notes out via email as well as sharing. So actors get to listen, they write them down, and they get to read them. So there's 3 opportunity points for somebody to learn there. And then finally, here are some suggestions for things you might do when somebody has a need, so case-by-case basis. You might provide visual or video schedules of what to expect in an audition. If you are a professional theater, you might just have a standard video that you could have, but if you have somebody who has a need and reading is difficult, I might record a video, or I've had stage managers call my actors and tell them this is your call time for tonight versus emailing them. If necessary, you might use extra time in your rehearsal process, extend it. This can be challenging for folks who have other jobs, who have kids, etc., but sometimes it can be really useful because it just buys you more time to rehearse and to memorize. You might highlight scripts with their lines marked. If you have a lot of actors who don't consent to the read-through on the first day, you could have other people read it. You could provide a recording. You could show a video of a different production. Or you could make a visual kind of storyboard of the script. So there's a couple other more high labor substitutions if you have a need. You might let your actors not be memorized and use alternatives. They might have a script in their hand, or it might be camouflaged in their hand. You might use a teleprompter. You might have other actors prompt them, or a stage manager prompt them. You might ask them to improvise. You might provide a note taker for blocking. This is a common accommodation in classroom settings, right? Note takers. Think about your extra class settings where somebody might need a note taker. So in theater, the stage manager writes the blocking in addition to the actors, but I have some actors who'll rely on that stage manager. I might post visual scene lists backstage. I'll show you what that looks like in a second, or provide individual scene lists. And sometimes I'll offer entrance queuing. So I'll have a stage manager backstage saying, you go on now, if an actor requests it. This is an example of a visual schedule. Oops. For She Kills Monsters. So visual schedules, you might be familiar with them in elementary schools where it's like lunchtime and then here's a picture of a book for story time, right? They're also very useful for the autistic community, and I use them because they're low text, so they're useful for folks with reading disabilities. This was one created by my assistant stage manager, so I have a couple things I might tweak. But generally, you can see it shows the picture of what scene we're going to be rehearsing. You can look at this and know I'm doing the cheerleader scene. I'm going to have a break in the middle. And I then have very minimal text on the side that someone can just quickly look at and know. And if you're outside the process, of course, you're not going to know what this means. But if you're inside the process, you will. And then similarly, this is an example of a visual scene list that I would post backstage. This was from Romeo and Juliet. So there's no text at all except for it's Act 1, Scene 4, but my actors can look at it and they'll know, oh, that's the Queen Mab scene. Oh, that's the party scene. Oh, that's the scene after the party where we're all hungover. So somebody outside the process won't know, but somebody inside can just really quickly look and say, oh, I know that is, without having to do any reading. So I've talked a lot, and I'm going to shift it to you in small groups, and this will be a nice segue out. You're not theater makers, except for a couple of you. But I think there are connections, I hope there are connections you can make to your own work. So if you could turn to your neighbor, or your table, or your group, we're going to do a good old-fashioned think, pair, share. And so things you're thinking about, where are the places you teach that are not a traditional classroom setting? If you're not teaching anymore, get creative with this answer. And then think about the accommodation requests you receive for class and how might you apply them to your extracurricular settings. And then see if you can brainstorm even one more additional way outside of those emails from V where you could make your learning environments more accessible. And then I'd love for folks to share out at the end, but this is the go for that. Can I get a volunteer from groups to share out some of what y'all were talking about? Super exciting. This is just like in your classroom when nobody answers. I know. Who did the reading? No one. No. Yeah.
Something we were talking about is like, we talk about not traditional classroom settings, like our meetings, where we kind of assume we're all adults and therefore we no longer have needs that need to be met. Like not being able to hear, not being able to see things, or needing to review things later or review things beforehand. So that's something even in our peer groups that we don't really think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's something I'm always conflicted about. I generally read everything that's on the slide to help people who reading is hard. But when we're in a conference setting, academic, that's usually frowned upon, right? So I think that's a great point that we still have needs even as adults in our meeting settings. Yeah. Other thoughts to share?
One thing I'm thinking about is not necessarily neurodivergence, but emotional and mental. I feel like some of these students, it's if you were just to say, hey, are you having a bad day today? Or if you knew that that's where they were coming from, then you could treat them in a fairer way, instead of just expecting, excellent performance from them every day.
Yeah, that's why I like the access check-ins. And I do a community agreement in all my classes, and I kind of let check-ins come from that. So I have had classes where students say, hey, we really want to check in every day. And then I usually do I don't always do a formal access check-in because I have my students send me I do a survey at the beginning of class asking their access needs, but I'll ask for an energy check-in. Where are you at 1 to 10? But it takes like 30 seconds to do the whole class, and that way, I mean, it's harder in like a big lecture class, but in a smaller class, you can really get a sense of where a student's at. And I'll change my instruction even too, like, oh wow, energy's really low. Okay, we're not going to do the game that involves running. We'll warm up a different way. Yeah. Cool. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Dr. Montgomery, for giving me this opportunity.